here's what was happening. Throughout the 90s, if you were to ask people, anybody who remembers or who was old enough to remember what happened in Africa in the 90s, you would know that in the 90s, Africa was a place of, the first things that were happening on the continent in the 90s were wars, a lot of civil wars, Black Hawk Down, the Rwandan genocide, the Liberian Civil War, the Sierra Leonean Civil War, what was called Africa's World War, when Rwanda, Zimbabwe, Uganda fought in the Democratic Republic of Congo with different rebels there. And so with all of these wars happening across the continent, then they precipitated humanitarian disasters. You have huge numbers of internally displaced people, and you have had refugees. I too was a refugee during the war. I finished high school in a refugee camp in Cote d'Ivoire. So this was one of the things that was happening in Africa in the 90s, a lot of wars. And those wars were in part funneled, driven by what had happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Light weapons became easily available, and enterprising people sold arms to rebel groups across the continent, and so you had wars. And with the wars, like I said, you have significant humanitarian crisis, but that wasn't the only thing. There was a huge disease burden. HIV/AIDS, if you remember, throughout the 90s and early aughts, was ravaging the continent. Central and Southern Africa were being wiped out. You had entire villages where there were 2 generations with a missing generation. You had the grandparents and the children, and the entire generation of parents were wiped out. So you had that. You had malaria. You had all of the tropical diseases you can think about. Those were happening. So it was not just the wars that were ravaging the continent. It was also the disease burden. Then something came back to bite us. A lot of African countries had taken out significant debt in the 70s, and that debt then came due. And so we came to an instance where most African countries were spending up to 60% of government revenues on just simply servicing debt. And in some instances, it was just interest, not even the, and because for years they had not serviced the debt, they accrued punitive interest and punitive charges. And so, let's go back, you had wars, disease, debt. Within this context, very few companies, very few in the West looked at Africa as a place to do business. Most of Western policy toward Africa was actually filtered through the lens of development and aid. This was the picture of what was happening in Africa in the year 2000.